Thank you to Ben Dillo for reading the scripture, which is Jeremiah 31, 7-14. And the sermon is called Coming Home. A couple of days ago, we celebrated New Year's Day. Probably a lot of us are kind of glad to see a new year and hoping that it will be much better than the last one. In the lectionary, we're still celebrating Christmas, though. We're in Christmastide, and we're there until Epiphany begins on January 6th. And so these are the final days of the Christmas season, and it's the second Sunday of Christmas. At times like this, it's easy for me to get nostalgic, to think about Christmases past. Often my thoughts go back to the Christmases of the 90s when my kids were young. And the days, a couple days after Christmas, we would all pack up the car and we would drive up to Pine Grove, California, and we would go there to be with my dad and his wife, Mary. My siblings and their families, or else their boyfriends, girlfriends, significant others, would be there too most of the time. We would all gather, we'd all work our way there so that at least by New Year's Day, all of us were together at Dad and Mary's house in Pine Grove. Sometimes Mary's niece would even come. It was a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom house, and all of us would gather there, but it was a really big house for not having that many bedrooms and bathrooms. It was quite large with a big living room and a huge dining room, a big dining room table that no matter how many of us came, we could all fit around the dining room table. The house was tucked in the tall trees in the woods in the Sierra foothills, and it was a beautiful place to go. In many ways, after the hustle and bustle of Christmas and everything leading up to Christmas Day, though those things weren't bad, those were great. It was really nice to have some quiet time to celebrate Christmas again with the family in a more quiet and relaxed kind of situation. It was really enjoyable. There was gift giving, there was we would play games and we would do puzzles. We would shop in town at our favorite little local shops, and there was a lot of eating that would happen. It was like coming home for Christmas, even though technically it was only home to Dad and Mary. Pine Grove was not home for any of us. Mary was not mother of any of us. In my generation, we had 5 siblings. 3 sisters from my dad's first marriage and 2 brothers from my dad's second marriage. At times, some of us were married and we had children. Others weren't married, but they would bring a boyfriend or girlfriend, or they would come by themselves. Some of us only saw each other in Pine Grove, and that was the only time that we connected. Others of us were close and we connected throughout the year, or we even lived near each other at the time or whatever. Oftentimes, it tended to coincide with whether or not we shared a mother. And yet, coming to Pine Grove felt like coming home. Old or new, in-law or outlaw, young or old, it didn't matter that none of us grew up there, that we didn't live there. In fact, actually, by not living there, by not growing up there, it made it feel a little bit more like home, because in a way we were more on an equal footing when we went there. When we were growing up, my sisters and I spent time with my dad at a house that wasn't ours. My brothers had their rooms and their belongings and their routine. And we entered into their routine, and we were sort of like guests, but sort of not. For them, we were invading their space and interrupting their lives. But in Pine Grove, none of us laid claim to the house Some would sleep in the guest room, some would sleep in the motorhome, some would sleep in the sunroom and the pull-out couch, and all the kids would camp out in the living room. One year there were so many of us that my dad set up the tent trailer in the garage, and my brother called it the Price is Right showroom. Of course, we had to take turns with just 2 bathrooms. And every place, every room had its advantages and its disadvantages. And sometimes someone might even give up and say, you know, I'm going to go stay in a hotel. And that hotel was about 10 miles away. The problem was that when they stayed in the hotel, they missed out on what might happen late at night. Some of those conversations, even some of those kind of heated debates or fun times of laughter that would happen late at night, that were unplanned and sort of spontaneous. All that made us feel at home in a place that none of us had ever lived, with people we call family, some of whom we only connected with in Pine Grove, and some of whom we had even never met before. Over the years, it became a place of reconciliation. Old hurts and moldy misunderstandings were worked out, smoothed over, and healed, allowing for relationships that continue even into this day. Even though my dad has been gone for 4 years and Mary lives far away in Pine Grove, that Pine Grove house is just a bunch of warm memories. And our gathering place is now sitting in front of a computer screen. But for me, those days after Christmas in Pine Grove will always be what come to mind when I think about coming home. Coming home, that's the message of the normally doom and gloom prophet Jeremiah in this passage. In this prophecy, with the joyous promise of the exiles coming home, we feel the sense of joy and the relief and the anticipation of people being reunited in their home after years and even generations of exile and foreign occupation. But home isn't the home they left. When conquered by the Babylonians, the royal family, the elite, the educated, the powerful, and the influential, they were the ones who were taken far from home and they lived in exile. The more ordinary folk stayed behind in the homeland that was occupied by a foreign power. As strife and unrest continued, more and more of those people would move out even into neighboring countries and far away to escape. And eventually, the temple was even destroyed. In exile, the people of God had to live into their identity, apart from their homeland and apart from the temple. They discovered what it meant to be faithful to God while living in a land that did not know their God, in places that were culturally counter to the way that they lived and to their religious practices. We see examples of this when we read about Esther and Nehemiah and Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Whether in exile, far from home, or in the rubble of their occupied homeland, they discovered what faithfulness to God was all about, without the trappings of which they had previously took advantage. But now they looked at coming home. For many, it was a home in which they had never lived. They had never seen it. For others, it looked so drastically different than the one that they had left behind so long ago. The home they left behind was in bad shape. It was filled with strife and inequality. It did not live up to God's dream of what God's community was supposed to be about. It made them weak. And as a consequence, they were conquered by a foreign power. The home that is described in the prophecy that Jeremiah shares looks different. They are to return home to a society that is more equitable, where the weak are not left behind, where a pregnant woman, even in labor, is not seen as a liability or a drag on the journey home, but as a joyful promise of a future that is full of possibilities. Even the blind and the lame are a part of the company returning home. There's singing and dancing, and those who are weeping are consoled. They return with wisdom, the lessons of being exiles, an understanding of their identity as the people of God that can only come from being far from home or in a home that's occupied by other powers. Home is home, but it's different. This prophecy sounds like the fulfillment of Advent. After waiting and longing, they're able to come home and rebuild their lives at home. And yet we know that even when they come home, it's not perfect. It would be some time before Messiah would come, and even longer before the Holy Spirit would fall on the followers of that Messiah, as the people of God would be at home in every nation and every generation on earth. We hear the familiar sounds of Jeremiah 31 in Mary's song in Luke. God's mercy is from those who fear him from generation to generation. God has lifted up the lowly and filled the hungry with good things. And in the sermon of Peter at Pentecost, as he quotes Joel, I will pour out my spirit and your sons and daughters will prophesy. In Jeremiah, we see a picture of what it is like to come home. Not the home they left long ago, but a home where everyone is home. Everyone is welcome. They know what it's like to be far from home, to feel the sense of isolation and not being understood as they're far away from home. And so when they come home, they have an understanding of what it means to include everybody. Home, where people know what it means to be God's people because of the wisdom that can only come from being in exile. After what will be a year or more of living in the realities of this pandemic and all that has been compounded and exacerbated by it, we're ready to come home. Now, in a way, it's strange to think about coming home. In a way, it's strange to think about coming home because we've actually been stuck at home. Maybe in a way, we're ready to leave home. We've been stuck at home for so long, and our normal life of coming and going has been so drastically changed. We haven't been able to go on the trips that we like. We haven't been able to spend time with family and friends in the way that we would like. And as a church family, we miss being physically present together with one another. We miss the sights and the sounds and the feelings of being at church with each other. And now there's light at the end of what seems like a very long tunnel. We are ready to come home, but home isn't what it used to be. It can't be. It's not like the home we left. Not that it was all that bad, but it needs to be different now because we are different. The world is different. And so what have we learned as we've been in exile? What have we learned in our time in the wilderness? We've learned new skills. We've learned new horizons, new resources, new means of outreach and ministry. We've learned a little bit about what's happening in our community and in our world. We've learned about new partnerships that will make a difference in people's lives for years to come. We've gotten to know each other better. We've figured out how to stay in touch, to care for one another and work with each other, whether we're down the street, a mile or two away, or in a different state or country. What have we learned about God? What have we learned about ourselves? How will all of this impact our coming home? Now is the time to pray. Now is the time to reflect. Now is the time to dream. And yes, now is the time to grieve and to weep, knowing that God will bring us consolation. May we turn once again to the God who loves us, the Christ who gives us our identity, and the Spirit who empowers us and gives us vision as we discover what it means to come home.